I can hear some wind noise in the previous podcast, but if it's too bad, please report to me because I insist on continuing without AC in a hot city like Mumbai, just for my own self-satisfaction that I'm doing something. But nonetheless, let's continue this story about the Anthropocene and where we are headed in terms of climate and evolution. How do we think about the future? We already talked about shared socioeconomic pathways, but we also need to think about vulnerabilities and risks. IPCC has developed a framework for risk, which is considered a multiplier of vulnerability, hazard, and exposure. So based on your wealth, your building you're living in, and so on, your vulnerability is determined, your socioeconomic status, per capita, GDP, etc. Hazard can be natural, extreme, climate change impacted extreme events and so on, floods, droughts, wildfires, health emergencies and so on. And exposure depends on population density, infrastructure and so on. So that's the framework used here, and in this loop we are looking at climate change with causes, impacts and risks. So the climate change impacts ecosystems including biodiversity, but that also is associated with limits to adaptation, losses and damages. So impacts can come from this side as human societies struggle with limits to adaptation and losses and damages. So you can see the feedback there. And human society can conserve and restore, and ecosystem biodiversity are important for provision, livelihoods, ecosystem services, which means the benefits we get from ecosystems like fisheries, forestry, agriculture and so on. And ecosystems including biodiversity require us to adapt to and mitigate climate change. But climate change also impacts human societies on this side, and human society adapts, so dealing with things that they cannot control like extreme events, heat waves, etc. But also can be maladaptation, where there are many examples. We talked about growing wheat in a place where this will not be possible under certain conditions, like it happened in the Middle East, in Syria and so on in the more recent years. And human society tries to mitigate its own impact on climate change, on climate. And of course human society has created the whole problem by increased greenhouse gas emissions. So this is then feeding back to urgent to timely action, which requires governance, finance, knowledge and capacity, catalyzing conditions and technologies. Okay, so the risk propeller here shows the risk emerges from overlap of climate hazards, vulnerability and exposure, which I mentioned. These are of human systems, ecosystems and their biodiversity. So these are not necessarily global measures. You can find lots of literature on vulnerability and exposure and climate hazards for specific places like Bangladesh or parts of India, northwest, northeast, peninsular India, Western Ghats. All have different hazards, different vulnerabilities and different exposures. This is true for any part of the world as well. As a whole, global south, the developing countries and poor countries, are much more vulnerable and at risk from climate impacts, even though climate change historically has been largely created by the developed world or the global north. Okay, future climate change in terms of limiting global warming, we have to think about the similar phase space where we look at climate resilient development. So human health and well-being, equity and justice have to be worried about, ecosystem health and planetary health. It's not just us, it's about protecting and taking along everything that is on the planet. So the ecosystem transitions that are expected from future climate change that include land, freshwater, coastal and ocean ecosystems, and their biodiversity have to be protected with adaptation and mitigation of future climate change, adapt to and mitigate future climate change, which is going to impact both ecosystem transitions and human systems. ecosystem transition. So now we are already talking about evolution of human society, at least behaviorally, to respond to future climate change, right? So this includes societal, energy, industry, urban, rural, and infrastructure, which are in turn going to affect ecosystem transitions as well. And human society is behaviorally going to have to require conserving and restoring ecosystems and biodiversity, helping the transitions. So ecosystem-based approaches is a very broad term. You can go and look at my other other courses and podcasts where I discuss this in more detail. So continued ecosystem transitions should not affect too severely the provisions in terms of livelihoods and ecosystem services that we talked about, which then affect the human systems and their transition under future climate change, as well as their ability to continue to conserve and restore. There will be winners and losers. There are already winners and losers under global climate change, but hopefully the global human society can continue to maintain equity and justice as well. So again, adapt to and mitigate to future climate change from the human systems transition point of view. Let's quickly look at the impacts of climate change that are already observed in ecosystems and human systems worldwide. This is from the IPCC Assessment Report 6 that I mentioned, which is being released already in completion by now. So observed impacts of climate change on ecosystems, looking at different regions and different systems. So changes in ecosystem structure, specific range shifts, and changes in timing or phenology in terms of when blooms happen, when fall arrives, how winter arrives late or early, extreme events, and so on and so forth. So phenology of crops, plants, animals, etc. So globally, you can see terrestrial, freshwater, and ocean ecosystem structures have been affected, and we can say that with high or very high confidence. There are many things which in which we have medium confidence, low confidence, or evidence is limited and insufficient, and there are places where these are not applicable. So just broadly look at the range of things. Globally, we have affected all of these things in terms of ecosystem structure, species range shifts, and phenologies, and we can say that with high or very high confidence. When you get to regional levels, data become an issue. So in Africa, you can say much about ecosystem structure changes, but not so sure about freshwater ecosystem changes, for example, because there is limited or insufficient evidence, and phenology has even less confidence, either with limited or no or insufficient evidence or low confidence in phenologies. And similarly, you can basically focus on the large number of blue dots across the planet, which says that with high or very high confidence we can say there have been impacts of humans in the Anthropocene on ecosystem structure changes, species range shifts, and changes in timing or phenologies. This also indicates how we need to monitor the systems much more carefully going into the future as we continue to have emissions and impacts on the planet, right? So it's a call for data gathering needs and monitoring needs, and there are increasing efforts as well to do this. But in a zero-sum game, if you put money into monitoring things and instrumentation, it might affect finance for adaptation, mitigation, and other things, especially for poorer countries. So climate finance tries to worry about how to help vulnerable countries do these things. Okay. Observed impacts of climate change on human systems. So you can look at impacts on water scarcity and food production. So human systems, there are water scarcity, agriculture and crop production, animal and livestock health and productivity, fisheries yields, and aquaculture production. And impacts on health and well-being include infectious diseases, health malnutrition and others, mental health, climate migrations or displacements, and impacts on cities, settlements, and infrastructure, which include inland flooding, associated damages, flood or storm-induced damages in coastal areas, damages to infrastructure, damages to key economic sectors, and so on. Again, similar protocols or signs showing positive or negative impacts, and low confidence, high confidence, and lack of evidence. Okay, so globally, here we are with the various systems, mostly negative impacts. So you want to focus on blue colors with negative signs, which means we have had negative impacts with very high confidence. So heat, malnutrition, other, for example, in terms of water scarcity and food production, medium confidence but mostly negative impacts. And here cities, settlements, infrastructures, more high confidence, negative impacts. And you can then cascade through the various regions and each of these sectors. Okay, it gives you a sense that the impacts of humans is now well manifest across the globe in all these sectors, especially on things that affect us most directly in terms of human systems, food production, health and well-being. And urban centers where populations continue to increase are especially vulnerable hotspots where population densities make exposures and vulnerabilities worse for the same climate hazard. So risks are very high. Obviously, global economies are regional, local, national, global economies are being hit because of these, and technological solutions for mitigation and adaptation that are being developed in terms of renewable energy, solar panels, wind, transportations, EV, energy storage systems, and so on. The questions as we go forward are, how do we share these intellectual properties? Are they going to be made available to developing countries? For example, the refrigerant for air conditioning have to be replaced. HFCs are very dangerous for greenhouse effect. So alternatives to HFCs are already being implemented in the global north or developing countries. In developed countries, as developing countries get warmer, like parts of Africa, China, India, and economies grow, more and more ACs will be bought. Already this number is high. So how do we make sure that ACs don't continue to have positive feedback on climate change? Will the rich countries share the IPs and so on, and finance? So we will look at how countries are trying to deal with it and look at the impacts of such warmings on the various systems as well. So I will show the IPCC way of rendering impacts and how the book has captured the impacts based on warming levels on various systems across the globe. So that'll give us a sense of where we are headed and what we are trying to do in terms of protecting ourselves, ecosystems, and other species from our impact, or our impact on climate and climate impact on them. Okay.